So that's the first problem with those perspectives, is that they're not true. Secondly, one way or the other, they make an assumption. And along the many mythologies that bedevil the addiction field is this idea that drugs are addictive. And we know they're not. I mean, let me ask you this question. Is alcohol addictive? Well, if I asked amongst you here how many have ever had an alcoholic beverage, most of you, I dare say, would put your hand up. But if then I asked how many of you had an addictive relationship to alcohol, it'd be a much smaller number. If the alcohol was addictive in itself, you should all be addicted. You should all be alcoholics. Most people will try most drugs, whether it's heroin, crystal meth, cocaine, cigarettes, caffeine, alcohol, never become addicted. Therefore, you cannot explain the addiction by the power of the drug itself. Nor can you therefore stop addiction by trying to stop the availability of substances. The real issue is, why are some people driven to addictive behaviors? What is it that impels them in that direction? And once they've had that experience, why can't I give it up? Now for that, you have to look at the individual lives and social issues in a broader context. You're not going to resolve that one by doing brain scans on people and showing that they've impaired brain circuits, which they do. But how did they get there? That's the question. And what I'm suggesting to you that if the choice model and the disease model are inadequate to the explanation of addiction, then what's really going on? What's really going on is that the central fact about human existence is utterly ignored in mainstream medical theory, which is that the brain is inseparable from the body and the individual is inseparable from the environment. So that you can't separate brain physiology from the environment. Now, why does trauma like that predispose to addictions? And I'm not saying that everybody who's traumatized becomes an addict, but I'm saying that the more trauma there is, the likelihood is far greater of addictive behaviors later on. Because it's an adaptation. The addiction is a self-soothing behavior. You see it in little babies. They'll suck their thumbs, will they not? When they're not getting the nourishing they need, emotionally. Well, they'll rock themselves. Or they'll masturbate. These are self-soothing behaviors. These are adaptations to lack of nurture. So why is it, how is it that early trauma or emotional loss then predisposes to addiction? Well, first of all, because those brain circuits will not develop the way they ought to. So physiologically, it has an effect. It's not just an emotional event, it's a physiological event that has an impact on brain circuitry, possibly for a lifetime. Number one. Number two, it gives you that tremendous pain that then you try and soothe through substance use or some other addictive behavior. So you got the pain. Number three, you're fundamentally ashamed of yourself. Because the child looks at everything in a very egocentric perspective, like he or she is the center of the universe. When stuff happens, it's because of him and her. So if good stuff happens, I'm a good person, I must be. But if mommy is unhappy, if I'm being beaten or being traumatized, then that's because I'm worthless. This is a deep sense of shame about the very self that predates the addiction. Of course, the addiction induces more shame, as I can tell you personally, but the shame was there already. And then, because of that shame, you emotionally isolate yourself, which further increases the need to soothe yourself. And in the spiritual sense, when the world treats you that badly in your formative years, then what kind of a worldview are you going to have? You're going to have a view of the world that's basically indifferent or even hostile. There's not going to be any sweet God in your theology. There's either going to be no God at all, or a God that has singled you out for punishment. So spiritually,
we're going to talk about addiction. As a psychology major and a recovered addict myself, I have unique insight into this subject. Being a crusader for addiction counseling, you guys are probably wondering why I said recovered addict instead of recovering addict, and why the title of the video is Don't Follow the 12-Step Program. We'll get into the last part in a minute, but the reason I don't call myself recovering is because I don't consider myself recovering. I consider myself recovered. Calling yourself recovering is part of the 12-step program, and I think it's complete bullshit. And for reference, this doesn't just apply to alcohol. They have Narcotics Anonymous too, NA. And I went to a few of those groups when I was recovering. It's the same thing. Same steps, same process, same chips, same everything. That being said, let's start off with the first step. Step 1. We admitted we were powerless over drugs or alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. Seems fairly harmless, right? But I don't feel like it is. It's priming you to feel helpless without this specific program. When getting clean, you must understand that you have a hard road ahead of you, and you're better off without it. But I've known people who got clean on their own and stayed clean. It's a lot more likely if you go through some kind of program, but you'll see a constant pattern of making people feel helpless and reliant on something. Let's continue. Step 2. We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Okay, what do they mean by a power greater than ourselves? That's kind of ambiguous. And what does it have to do with addiction? Why do I need a power greater than myself to restore me to sobriety? Can't I be restored to sobriety through hard work and the assistance of a group of friends and counselors who support my efforts? This is confusing. Next one. Step 3. Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. Okay, now it's getting stupid. What does God have to do with this process? This step could just read, "Get saved by Jesus," and it would have the same meaning. Why do I need to be saved? I'll tell you exactly why this step matters. Because this program is trying to replace an addiction to a substance with God. They both act on the brain in similar ways. What happens when your faith is challenged? It seems like a dangerous road to go down. No, this is a bad step, and it should be completely removed. The person should find an internal reason to quit, not an external one. I've seen many people quit for the sake of girlfriends or a child. The problem is that if that girlfriend takes off, or if you get into a fight with your son or daughter, you go right back to it. It wasn't genuine. You didn't have an internal reason. You didn't want to stop because you're hurting the people around you, or because you don't like who you are when you're high, or because you're sick of being sick all the time. You quit because you didn't want some specific person to think less of you. Remove this step and replace it with, "We found an internal reason to quit." Step 4. Made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. I can see why this could be useful. It could push somebody into finding an internal reason to quit, realizing what kind of horrific things they've done when they were high or to get high. Stealing, lying, hurting people. I'd keep this step, but I'd place it further up the list. It should be near the top, maybe 1 or 2. Step 5. Admitted to God, ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. Why is God in that list? What does God have to do with this, aside from the fact that He's replacing the addiction itself? If you dropped God from the list, I can see how this might be useful. Maybe saying the wrongdoings out loud would make it real for somebody, make them accept what they've done. But don't give me any of this, "I've had sex before marriage" garbage. It would have to be real wrongdoings, like stealing or hitting somebody. If it were real to them, it might make the motivation to quit stronger. Step 6. We're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. What? Why is God peppered through this whole fucking list? We're ready to have Him remove our defects? I'm sorry, but I view God as a defective character. Let's start by removing that. We could take this whole step out, and it would only make this list better. Step 7. Humbly ask Him to remove our shortcomings. Worthless step. Nobody can remove our shortcomings. Only we can change how we act. We shouldn't be pushing the burden off onto somebody or something else. Take responsibility for your actions and change them. Don't rely on somebody else to fix it for you. Step 8. Made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Now this one I can agree with, except usually there's a bit at the end that says, "except where it would cause harm to do so." I think that's fine, but it's going a little bit overboard. I don't think this step is specifically required. Maybe try to make amends. It isn't a hard and fast rule. Try making amends after you've gotten yourself back on your feet. Then your amends can come with tangible changes. Step 9. Made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. Oh, I guess I was skipping ahead. Repeat yourself much? Well, like I said, it isn't a hard and fast rule, and I feel like the amends would mean a lot more coming from somebody who had some sober time under their belt. Put this one further up the list. Maybe do it after 3 to 6 months of being clean. Step 10. Continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. Okay, are 12 steps really required? I could have cut this list down to like 4 things. Yes. Take a personal inventory. That's very important. It's like the first thing you should do. Let's move on. Step 11. Sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. Oh, come on. I'm gonna be sick. What does this have to do with recovering from drugs or alcohol? You need to be actively doing things to move toward a goal. Come on, people. This is like a church advertisement. And finally, step 12. Having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. Obviously, step 12 is intended to try to get these people who have just replaced drugs or alcohol with Jesus to make other people replace drugs with Jesus. Jesus is not an internal reason. The first time your faith is challenged, you risk falling right back into it. There's no longer a reason to stay sober. Jesus is a terrible reason to get clean. Get clean for yourself. So I've been talking shit about this program for about 5 minutes, but this has ostensibly done a lot of good in the world, right? Let's take a quick look-see at some of their statistics. I'm going to be nice and generous with these statistics, and I'm going to take them right from Alcoholics Anonymous. According to their study, 27% of the participants stay sober for less than a year. 24% stay sober for 1 to 5 years. 13% for 6 to 10 years. 14% for 11 to 20 years. And 22% for longer than 20 years. Usually I address cults on my channel, so I know this is kind of an odd change of pace, but many feel like Alcoholics Anonymous is a cult. They have family members who've gone through it and won't stop talking about it, or talking about God, constantly. They cram it down people's throats, much like a cult would do. Proselytize non-stop. Aside from the fact that I view proselytizing about God non-stop as inherently harmful, AA is actively encouraging people to find an external reason to quit. Seriously, what happens when their faith is challenged? I have a better list to help you get off drugs. Here's my list. 1. Consider all the bad things you've done over the years. Think about why you don't want to do them anymore. 2. Cut off all contact with anybody who was ever associated with drugs. Change your phone number, move to a different neighborhood, whatever it takes. You'll never be able to quit until you get out of that environment. 3. Find a hobby. Scrapbooking, learn to play an instrument, learn computer programming, anything. Find something to occupy your time and your mind. 4. Build up a support network. Friends and family who are clean and want you to be clean too. 5. Find somebody you can talk to about your feelings and problems. Drug counselors are an ideal choice. Maybe find a drug or alcohol support group led by a trained and certified drug counselor. 6. Realize that you are the only one who can affect change in your life, and that you're responsible to take action to keep yourself clean. I've told this story on my channel before, but I was addicted to drugs for a few years. It was after my family started shunning me for leaving the religion, but ultimately I can't blame anybody but myself. When I first started to get clean, I was going to secular group counseling sessions. It was fantastic. I was paying like $200 a month to go to these groups. I loved it. I told my stories and other people told their stories. We all became good friends. We saw each other through the pain, physical and emotional. The place was owned and administrated by ex-drug addicts. I'm not saying you have to be an ex-addict to be a drug counselor, but it's a lot easier to relate to our situation when you've been through it too. It took me years to pull my life back together, but eventually I got to the point where I was sick of going to group counseling. The people were still great, but I started to see the fakers, and it bothered me a lot. At a certain point, I just didn't want a reminder of the fact that I was once an addict, so I stopped going. And ever since, I've called myself a recovered addict. I've been clean for almost 6 years now, and I'm a drug counseling activist as well as a religious activist. You don't need God in your life to get clean. If God is your sole motivation for getting clean, you're much more likely to relapse.
There's not going to be any sweet God in your theology. There's either going to be no God at all, or a God that has singled you out for punishment. So it's spiritually devastating as well. And all that goes into the making of the addict. Now, excuse me, another myth around addiction is that somehow the drug addict is different from the rest of us. That's another myth. It's not benign. And what am I after? I'm not after the classical music. Because after all the music I've bought and given away or sold again, just with the stuff I've left at home, if I started listening now and did nothing but listen, it would take years for me to hear all the music I already have. It's not about the having, it's about the getting. Because the getting releases dopamine in the brain. And that makes me very present and very alert and very alive and very motivated, and I like that. And I think just one more. But by next day, the high is gone, I feel listless and depressed again, and I start thinking about the one that I didn't pick up that I need to get back and get now. Now, how's that different from what my drug addicts do? As a matter of fact, if you look at the brain scans of shopping addicts or gamblers, it's the same circuits that light up, the reward and incentive circuits that light up in the brains of drug users. What I'm saying to you is there's a universal addiction process that's implicated in all addictions. And addiction, from my perspective, I may have said it before, but any behavior that you crave, that gives you temporary pleasure, temporary relief, but which you continue to participate in despite long-term negative consequences. That's what an addiction is. Clearly, addiction goes way beyond substances, and the brain circuitry is the same. Doesn't matter what the target is, whether it's internet or pornography or sex or gambling or drugs, it's the same brain circuits involved, it's the same emotional dynamics, it's the same spiritual emptiness, that same hungry ghost phenomena that drives you to keep looking to the outside for something. And addictions are always about trying to complete yourself from the outside, even temporarily. Now, unfortunately, every time you do that, you also wound yourself. Because every time you do that, what you're really saying to yourself is, I'm not enough. Further reinforcing your worthlessness. But it's not that the drug addict is any different from anybody else. That just happened to be their particular route. And then when you ask about the legal question, well, that's just a whole other nightmare. Because there's absolutely no science, logic, or humanity behind the drug laws. There's absolutely no reason why heroin should be illegal and tobacco should not be. Tobacco is far more dangerous to your health, unless you overdose. Alcohol does far more damage to the body and the organs, and the brain, than heroin will. Now this is a shocking fact, but it's simple science. So, by what logic did we decide that this is going to be illegal and be punished by draconian punishments, and people will sit in jail if they've been caught in possession of marijuana 3 times, 3 strikes and you're out, and you're going to be in jail for the rest of your life? Whereas you can advertise alcohol in Super Bowl and people can go drinking and and that's perfectly legal. What sense are we actually making? So the whole issue of drug addiction is beset by mythology. Now let me come back to the social question. So, here's a quote from, let me read you a couple of quotes. I mentioned the genetic argument, and let me just point out to you that studies of both animals and human beings have shown that even if you're born with certain genes that can predispose you to addiction, it's the environment that'll decide whether you'll be addicted or not. So if you're a monkey born with a certain gene that protects you from the sedative effects of alcohol, so you can drink a lot of alcohol and really enjoy it and not get tired or uncoordinated. So these monkeys are predisposed to be addicted to alcohol, but if these same monkeys are brought up by their mothers, that gene is turned off. It's turned on only in those genes that are brought up away from their mothers in the peer group. So it's the environment that turns gene on and off. And in human beings, it's been shown that children were born with some serotonin gene that's a little bit altered, which would predispose them to addiction, but if they're brought up in nurturing homes, they have no more chance of being addicted than anybody else. So the whole genetic argument is tiresome and utterly boring as far as I'm concerned scientifically, and it's based on utterly false premises. Primary is that because something runs in a family, it's got to be genetic, which is, shallow logic. And I'm not going to go into if somebody asks me about it, I'll say more about it, the twin studies and all that, but they're all based on false logic. And nobody said it better than Louis Menand, who's a writer in the New Yorker magazine, and he said, it's all in the genes, is an explanation for the way things are that does not threaten the way things are. Why should anyone feel unhappy or engage in antisocial behavior when that person is living in the freest and most prosperous nation on earth? It can't be the system. There must be a flaw in the wiring somewhere. Now, if you actually look at the system, there's another quote I'd like to offer you. This is by Hubert Selby Jr., who was an American author who died some years ago, but in his preface for his wonderful addiction novel, Requiem for a Dream, which is also a great movie, by the way. It's the most harrowing addiction film you'll ever see. Ellen Burstyn, just magnificent in it. And Julia Roberts got the Academy Award for Pretty Woman that year. But Hubert Selby writes, I believe that to pursue the American dream is not only futile but self-destructive, because ultimately it destroys everything and everyone involved with it. By definition, it must, because it nurtures everything except those things that are important. Integrity, ethics, truth, our very heart and soul. Why? The reason is simple. Because life is about giving, not getting. Life is about giving, not getting. So as soon as you buy into that ethic of materialism, our next book, just about to write it, it's going to be called Toxic Culture. As soon as you buy into that, you're isolating yourself from your true nature and from social connection. And you're setting yourself against everybody else. Well, that itself is destructive. And how that shows up, we can clearly see by the examples of the Aboriginal population. So I raised the issue that they had these substances that weren't addicted. Well, 3 years ago, I was leading a healing ceremony at a